Welcome to the Outskirts Film Podcast. I'm Öykü, and today I'm joined by my co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Alonso Hilar.
Merhaba, I'm Christopher.
Oh, we're doing that?
Yeah, always try.
Bereketli tarlalar, yüreğim kadar coşkun dere. Selam size. As you have probably guessed from these unfamiliar words, today's episode is about a Turkish filmmaker. The filmmaker we'll be discussing is an exceptionally prolific one. But again, when it comes to quantity, Turkish cinema has no shortage of directors who made hundreds of films during the golden age of the industry, officially known as Yeşilçam. Yet only a few, and I truly mean when I say few, managed to create enduring works across such a wide range of genres, including melodramas, musical comedies, social dramas, historical epics, folk tales, and psychological character studies. So without further ado, let us dive into the cinema of Atıf Yılmaz. Like many of his contemporaries, Atıf Yılmaz was a filmmaker constantly working under financial constraints and within the socio-cultural expectations of Turkish audiences. While juggling audience-friendly historical adventure flicks and soapy melodramas influenced by Egyptian cinema, he nevertheless tried, from the very beginning of his career in 1951, to build a distinct auteurist voice. But he was mostly known for his collaborative approach, particularly in his screenwriting partnership with major figures of Turkish literature, as well as for his creative collaboration with actors, musicians, painters, designers whose work was generously featured in his films. Not to mention his contribution to the careers of filmmakers such as Halit Refi and Zeki Ökten, who worked as assistants under his wing. With a body of work as large as Yılmaz, it's difficult to rely on simple categorizations. But still, if we use broader brush strokes, we can say that his work throughout the 60s and 70s was marked by a formal and aesthetic ambition to give Turkish cinema a more localized and to a certain extent a nationalized identity. Through his films, he sought to resist, rather modestly, the non-critical appropriation of Western cinematic codes. Although some would argue that his greatest masterpiece belongs to the 70s, it was in the 80s that his cinema became more refined, more inward-looking, and to a certain extent more feminine. Given our limited time and the scarcity of subtitles for many of his films, our viewing experience this week remains far from encompassing the entirety of his filmography. Still, considering this makeshift periodization across genres and decades, I would like to begin our discussion by asking which vein of Yılmaz's artistic practice you found most interesting.
I guess for me, there's like two particular moments that I think seem very interesting, which are like the mid 60s and then like the late 80s, which seem to totally different filmmakers. And I also, it's like a little bit my fault because I kind of missed like some of the important 70s films perhaps. So I jumped from this kind of like very popular kind of like populist as well, like kind of comedy filmmaker with some like genre elements. I can associate with a lot of like popular cinema from like Latin America and other parts of like Eastern Europe. Like that period to me is perhaps like the one I vibe with the most. In Latin America, we got a lot of like imports of like Turkish telenovelas or like melodramas, and I see a lot of that in those 80s films, like this very ornate, like colorful, hyper stylized, but also the acting register like very exalted. Like those things are kind of there. If there's one consistent aspect that I think I perhaps saw throughout, and we can get into it, is perhaps the figure of like outsiders and outcasts seem to be like a recurring theme. But again, I'm speaking just for a very, very limited sample. So Yılmaz specialists might just like be frowning right now.
My answer to your question is basically everything. I mean, there's basically any direction I could go inside this filmography and discover more. You know, there's sort of intimations just from looking at the films that are subtitled that I didn't see, that suggests a whole other universe of this filmmaker that I didn't experience whatsoever. The one 60s film I did see, as Alonso said, was like completely different from anything else that we've seen. I can guess that probably the other films from that decade have a lot in common with that. At the same time, you know, the 90s wasn't a period that I touched, and I know that there's a lot of interesting changes there as well.
I think while I was watching these films, the question that kept like bugging me was like, do Alonso and Christopher really enjoy these films, or do they like look at these films as this like curios or this historical artifacts that are meaningful or like valuable from a certain point of view. And maybe this is also a question that is linked to the question of identity, because obviously these films are made to reflect or to appeal to a certain identity. And I kept wondering, like, do these films really like cross the borders, or like achieve a certain universality, or do they really need to?
I wouldn't use the word kind of universality. I think, these films are like simultaneously very specific, and I think a lot of the shabby subtitles that we had to suffer with let down the films in a lot of ways. But also, they look and feel like a lot of films that from other countries. Like I commented that a lot of these films to me seemed kind of Latin American in some character and in some moments. And then, of course, there are these other things, these other elements that I can see are kind of distinctly Turkish. But the actual broader context, like the background against which I could like set these films and try and, make some kind of timeline, nothing. Really nothing. I mean, if I try to look at, a film like Oh, Beautiful Istanbul, up to even The Wretched Ones, the film he made with Yilmaz Güney, or The Girl with the Red Scarf, which is basically made in a 10-year period. I mean, I don't understand why those films are so different, being made in such a short period of time, and I don't know anything about the background between them, nothing. So it's a bit sort of like floating free in that sense.
Chris mentioned Latin American element. Then I eventually saw I think the film we were referring to is the saga of Ali of Keshan. Actually, I think you're right, actually. We can get into that. It was my favorite film I saw. I think part of that is because it feels very much so like something that will be produced like in Cinematografía Calderón in 1957 as well. Like the same kind of like just general like a narrative itself, like this like folk figure, this like semi-industrialized but also kind of like very like old school kind of environment, and a lot of like screen time is just like devoted to these like very local traditions and expressions per se of like taking some genre signifiers with like popular cinema from mainly like Hollywood, but also in this case you were mentioning like Egyptian cinema, and seeing that like reframed to like a local audience. I guess that's like perhaps the sense of universality I can get from them. But I was engaged just by virtue of like playing with those like the mannerisms and like the general structures are independent of context to be able to be enjoyed. But naturally, you're losing a lot of what I assume is a lot of like the local humor, a lot of like the nuance of the dialogue that is perhaps like more localized. But at least from my experience, just like on textural level and like narratives themselves, I feel like they're archetypical. So in that sense, they kind of work for me regardless of not really knowing what exactly they've been based on or the specifics of like the culture itself. So in that sense, I think the kind of film they are, and again like that populist aspect of something that I can imagine perfectly being shown as it happens in Latin America with Mexican films being shown like on like open television, like Sundays at 6 p.m. The movie that like all generation just says, oh yeah, I remember this film, and it's just like playing on the background while people are just like doing something else. That element I think also helps kind of engaging with these films to me.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because sometimes on this podcast, even with filmmakers that I love or I come to love, it can be kind of like homework watching these films, especially if you watch 8 or 9 by a single director, and if the films are very abrasive as well. In this case, I mean, there was just at some point when I was watching some of the films from the 80s, I was just like, this is such an easy watch, This is like, there's things going on, there's levels of tension and so on, but it's like, it's really designed for like to be an easy watch. There's not a lot, like there aren't a lot of barriers between you and the drama. And there's also, and maybe this is why I also make this association with Latin America, is that there's not a lot of filter between like you and the drama. Like it's so willing to like go there all the time, and there's not a lot of kind of things that are too distasteful to touch. It's like, no, we're gonna go there like for the sake of the story, we're gonna like change time, we're gonna jump forward, we're gonna do this, there's gonna be a voiceover here, there's gonna be this, that. So like on one hand you get this kind of like over plenty of like formal craziness, And on the other hand, it's like totally easy watching, you know, for the most part.
Some of the characters that, let's say, portray a girl from village is actually dubbed by someone, or all these like accents are faked by not necessarily the actor playing the person. These are dubbed characters. So I think there's also this level of artificiality, like especially in the saga of Ali of Keshan. And to add something about the easiness of the films, I think that's where the local context comes into play, because usually these are like adaptations of a Turkish novel or a Turkish legend, and then you added or discover a different layer of analysis or dialogue between the original text and the filmic text. And I think that's mostly true for Atıf Yılmaz films, because he often sought out to like collaborate with other writers, and often his films are adaptations or comments or maybe prolongations of existing material. So that's a different level, I think.
Morgol gömlek giyerdi, gümüş köstek takardı, hafif şehla bakardı. Yaktı mı kalpten yakardı. Taşta bıçak yarası, yüzde Halep çıbanı, kurşun yemiş ayağı, belli belirsiz aksardı. Evet, yeni çıkan şarkılar, akasyanın dalları, zalim güzel öldür beni. Yeni çıkan şarkılar var, Sinekli Dağ nefesi, Keşanlı Ali destanı var.
One thing I do sometimes is I open the filmography on Letterboxd and I sort by release date, and then I scroll and you can just see the different kinds of posters for different eras, almost like marking the different shades of a filmography. And in his case, it's just so different, like just that visual element, you know, like at the start it's sort of almost like these Soviet style posters, so very kind of old fashioned and heroic, also kind of like Mexican, you know, like whatever. And then at some point becomes a bit more sort of very populistic. Like I know he made a few films with Janet Orkin, and those are kind of these ridiculous 1970s posters of topless men, you know, and big block characters. And then it's like the 70s, and suddenly it's these arty, sort of tasteful posters and whatever. And then finally it gets to the 80s and it's like basically these kind of like soapy telenovelas, lots of women's faces and so on.
I don't think this is like a chronological progression. That's the thing, because it's like simultaneous branches that open up at the same time. Because when you see like Oh Beautiful Istanbul is also in the 60s, and you would also find these like a heroic films at the same period. So it's basically like doing all of them simultaneously. But speaking of the posters, I think some of the posters that are featured on Letterboxd are added there by the users. So I think the one that is like for the girl with the red scarf, that's not the official poster, obviously. Somebody just like designed that, and that's, or Ah Belinda, My Love. What is the other? I can't. That's the problem. I know the Turkish titles, but not the English ones, and many of them are not like the original version. So I would say like how to say Asiye, O Belinda, all these posters are just fake, like at least like newly designed, maybe for restorations, but I would say like to me the most coherent or like thematically coherent period is the 80s, because you have all these like films that he made with Müjdear and Hale Soygazi that is around women. So there's a clear thematic concern that he wants to like pursue and develop, and that's the only period that makes sense in his films, I think. And he goes way further in the 90s with Night Angel and Our Children.
No, I mean, you're right. Like, I was just looking at random that in 1975 he made both The Poor, or The Wretched Ones. So it's like multiple titles. The film with Yilmaz Güney, which is this like very pathos-filled neorealist what's it. And in the same year, he made this film called Deli Yusuf with Cüneyt Arkın, where Cüneyt Arkın is like topless in the poster, like punching someone, and has like a shoebox physique. And it's like about like a local hero who rises up against a warlord and so on and so on. So it's like in the same year, just sort of randomly flipping between these two poles of cinema.
He ambitiously tried to find a form that would relate the aesthetic qualities of these this period, like especially like how can I achieve the two-dimensional depiction of these more miniature-like figures through cinematic means. Not necessarily these films obviously reflect thoroughly these ambitions, but I think you can still find, like in his writings or in his interviews he gave during these periods, that he wanted to, especially through this historical tales, want to achieve this. And also the film we mentioned about Keşanlı Ali Destanı, the saga of Keşan of Ali, also is a condensation of the idea of myth, the legend. Because usually the legend is something that depicts heroes. But even though this piece is an adaptation of theater play, that is also the first epic theater play in the history of Turkish theater, there's the idea that kind of deconstructs the figure of the hero. And I think to a certain extent, from what I read, this idea of the construction of the hero, or the hero that is not necessarily full-fledged heroic, is also present in his other historical adventurous films.
Yeah, just looking at the filmography again, like what I thought about was when we were trying to establish some sort of logic to Lucio Fulci's like filmography, we were kind of like, oh, this is when the Fulci we know and love started, and then you immediately see like there's some like commedia italiana lowbrow thing just thrown in there, and it's kind of like this like kind of futile endeavor. If you put like a gun to my head, I couldn't really describe like what is Yilmaz like style, which also kind of begs the question to me of like you're seeing like the most popular ones on Letterboxd, because I just like looking at the reviews as well, they're mostly from like seems to be like Turkish cinephiles. I was wondering like how were those films also kind of like relating to the viewing practices of the context? Like, are the most popular ones the most like legendary ones? Because I've seen that sometimes, particularly in platforms like Letterboxd, you see like this like disconnect between what's popular in like the internet space and what was actually the repercussion, actual real life. Because in the Santo episode, I saw that a lot with a lot of like Santo films that were very, very popular in Mexico, haven't really gotten to like other spaces because again like lack of subtitles or like other technicalities.
I think definitely the films from 60s and 70s, because it was also the golden age of cinema. So the social melodramas that is also have the rural aspect, that I think from the films that we have seen, only probably Ali of Keşan would enter that category. His most like well-known and well-appreciated film was obviously The Girl with the Red Scarf, but that's to let's say a late that can be considered as a late period film in terms of his filmography, right? Because it's in the 70s, 77 or something like that. So I would say I think that part we haven't seen, but from what I observe, the 80 films, the woman films, are being rediscovered and reappreciated more by the contemporary cinephilia than they have been compared to the period when they have been released. Because it was also the decline of cinema. There was already the television, there was already the sex film. So even if people were watching these films, they weren't watching for the sake of art. They were probably watching for the sexuality.
Well, also I think those films are just kind of more ready-made for an audience of cinephiles now. And, you know, that's also why, you know, despite this guy having a mammoth filmography and having all these different aspects to his filmography, it's hard not to get the sense, at least for me, that period was the one where he was the most himself in some way. But that also could just be an illusion. They are kind of like popular melodramatic films, but they have these kind of eccentric interests. And for example, in My Dreams, My Love and You, which is not a film I really liked, maybe because I just felt like it was a little bit like watching a filmmaker who is too much out of the cage, because he's making all these cinephile gestures that I found kind of annoying in that film, that it's set in the context of cinema and you see projections and what is living, what is real, the iconography of a star, blah, blah, blah, So you feel like in that moment is, almost like the film he always wanted to make.
Derogatory.
Yes, derogatory. Exactly. But then, then you just think like, well, that totally makes sense why these films would be the ones that people would be discovering now, because they're so open to those kinds of readings,
For example, when I see A Lonely Woman, I feel like it's so embedded to do like the sexual awakening or the idea of woman discovering herself, this kind of trend. So to me, that film is very timely resonant. So when I watch that film from today's perspective, I watch it more as like a historical artifact. But then I watch Legend of Keşanlı Ali. That's a film that definitely like transcends the period, because it talks about political corruption, it talks about myth making, it talks about the difference between rural areas and cities. So there's also a kind of paradoxical aspect to that as well. Or the girl with the red scarf, like this, it's basically the story of a woman who's like torn between two men. Like if you strip to its bare bones, it's this story, and you can still feel its appeal from when you ignore the whole the background of the 70s. I think he's more himself because he can be more playful with the textuality. Like he can be more hypertextual, but also maybe self-referential, especially in his musical comedies. Like Ah Belinda is definitely it's a gimmicky thing, but it's also creates a inner narrative within the narrative.
From the outset, makes sense to me. Like those films have even started like are the ones most likely to cross over with perhaps like some aspect of Western cinephilia, because I think, as Chris was alluding to, like they have this kind of like cinephile catnip of like self-referentiality, or like perhaps conceptually more like up there in terms of like either My Dreams, My Love and You, and also like Avelinda. They're kind of like there to be like to be done some sort of like textual analysis in relation to like the like a female emancipation and all these kind of things, which I'm not saying in like a cynical way. Those kind of like readings are perhaps more available to those films, which are again like more universal, or kind of like you can see them like particularly like after like second wave feminism in the 70s, like kind of within that realm of like a filmic analysis. So it kind of makes sense to me also like those. I know again like the register is also perhaps more like a little bit more artsy, a little bit more like tasteful. If you wanted to sell to someone like a retrospective of Atıf Yılmaz, these were probably the films you would like show,
because they are limited or like made because of certain restrictions or expectations. He has to find ways to circumvent them, so it becomes more inventive to a certain extent. Maybe maybe we can say that it was more dominated by the star system. So often audiences would want to like watch a particular actor and actress, and they would have like a very tight schedules. So they have to like navigate those schedules, and also production companies were quite limited in what they could offer to audiences, because the distribution networks obviously had some certain expectations from the production companies. So the filmmakers weren't necessarily free in their artistic choices. So that's why I think like authorist readings during this period don't really work, because you have to play the game of the market, what they want from you. So for example, in this context, to me, Oh Beautiful Istanbul feels such a like a weird film, because I don't understand. I can't situate that film within the Yeşilçam aesthetics, nor formal, nor narrative concerns. Because usually you would have like films where I think like some very basic formulas of melodramas in that film is taken to a different levels about like the conflict between the traditional Turkish music and the Western influences. So to me, this is quite a UFO in that period. But you would also, I think, when you read a bit of his filmography and his biography, I think they would also experiment, and sometimes those experiments would fail.
Yeah, I think you can definitely tell that's the case with the saga of Ali of Kishan. Having just discovered Fikret Hakan in this film, I can imagine this being like a kind of a usual subgenre of films. Again, this like very like handsome, like mustache, like Turkish like heartthrob, being like, this is the reason the film exists. Just like the fact that these kind of journeyman filmmakers like have these like very specific like relationships, like I don't know, like as you were saying, like inspiration from novels, or like just the industry itself is in this kind of like voracious environment, consuming and repurposing like every other element that kind of makes them more interesting than they should be. At least that was my experience looking at this film, particularly like in the more like Western style elements where they showdown between the characters. You have this like random shot like from like below the characters, and you see like the like facades in this kind of like shadow play, and like what is happening in this film? It was like straight out of like a 1920s like German film or something. Going back to like the Latin American element of this like I don't know like craftsmen like filmmakers with a lot, perhaps like not really a lot of like filmic ambition in a traditional sense, but also like just by virtue of osmosis of being in all this like correlation like popular signifiers in popular cinemas, almost by accident perhaps at times, just creating these like very like idiosyncratic films. Because again, this is a film, the Saga of Ali of Kishan, which I don't think like in terms of genre I can really pinpoint to just one thing.
Later, like these, like the films that he made, these more kind of like metatextual elements that we were talking about, these more consciously cinephile elements, even though those films are still kind of popular melodramas, they're much more obvious. They're much more kind of raised to the level of text in those films. Whereas here, even though this is a film that is like very conscious of what it's doing, very purposeful, very well constructed in a kind of classical sense, you know, for like just to take an example, like the kind of ambiguity around this folk hero, particularly as it bears fruit in the end, you know, the questions of like killing this person, not killing this person, courage, the image facing in the crowd, and so on and so on. There's clearly an interest from Yılmaz in those things. That's clearly part of the film, but it's not quite text. You know, the film is still basically a genre film, and that's also, I mean, that's what I love about popular cinema from this era. Like, you can still have those things, you can still bask in those kind of metatextual elements, but they're not quite metatextual. You know, they're just like still embedded in the film. They're not so self-conscious. And the film is like too busy being 10 different things at once to, you know, really focus on being that serious. But that element is in there.
I mean, maybe I'm reading it too much, because I can still feel that in Ah Güzel İstanbul or Beautiful Istanbul, even though these films belong to like totally different registers. Like, because when you see Hashmet as a character, he has this like a idealized heroic vibe in him, right? Because he's also comes from an aristocratic background. His family comes from the twilight of the Ottoman Empire. So he's this like a almost fatherly figure to this young girl who comes from the village. But then he has bad habits. So he drinks, he's irresponsible, and he, in a way, through the exposition of his character, not necessarily through text, makes you understand that he's not the hero that you want him to be. He's just like a flawed as this young girl who steals her money. And maybe that's why I like this exploration better than his exploration of woman in some films, at least in A Lonely Woman. These are clearly films that comes from a concept or an idea that he imposes on his characters. And you feel that this is not like, they don't come from the character inside of the character, but more like impose. Okay, now I'm going to explore the condition of a young divorced woman and how she will behave around a young man.
Yeah, I think you can definitely see like this in Oh Beautiful Istanbul. Like, I don't know if this starts because again, like there's like just like a gigantic like blind spots all around, but I can see that film perhaps as having this more like a moral gray area, like even like in like a noirish sense at times. When I was seeing like the film, I was thinking about is like this like constant dialogue with the idea of morality and like I think at this point it's like beyond heroism and just like how these characters deal with that in the specificity of their context and how that can be like explored in like the different ways aesthetically as well.
Question, because I'm also more fascinated by like the saga of Ali of Keshan than, for example, My Girl with the Red Scarf. So I mean, this is the tradition of the pod of like not liking his most like renowned film, obviously. But what did you think of My Girl with the Red Scarf? Because it's definitely like the film, the Atıf Yılmaz film, the greatest Atıf Yılmaz film of all time, considered by most of the people.
I was afraid going into it that it would be horribly tasteful, but I don't know. Maybe it's also just a question of sensibility. Because I mean, I found this film really fascinating for a lot of reasons, and in a way, almost like this sort of middle ground between the two sort of, if we can reduce it in that way, like the two spheres that we've been talking about, like roughly the lowbrow and the highbrow. Because, you know, for half of this film, it's a very kind of sensitive melodrama about a woman being fucked over horribly by a man in ways that are like continually shocking for a melodrama. And then also it's just this kind of like borderline lowbrow comedy at times, you know, particularly in the early scenes when he's seducing her, and he's like at one point he uses his truck to chase her as a way to like get her to fuck him, basically. And
come on, they fuck after they get married, please.
Yes, of course. Sorry. How dare I? There's this tension in that film, almost like, you know, he's not totally surrendered to a sort of more kind of balanced tastefulness. It's there's still this kind of wildness to the film in those early parts, and he's trying to find different ways to show, you know, the act of seduction, almost like it's like a Raoul Walsh film at some point, you know, like trying to express affection through brutality or something like that. The protagonist kind of suffering because of this terrible man that she was in love with, a very handsome man, obviously, and she falls in love with this new guy who's kind of nice but boring, and that's the tension of the film. But I mean, it has these pleasures that only melodramas can give you. Like in melodramas, sometimes the play with time is so fascinating, and a more tasteful film would never do this. Time in this film is so fascinating, you know, it will just jump years ahead in a moment, and you know, there'll be a sequence set in a year, and then it'll jump again and go here and go here and go here. Each of the characters has a voiceover that doesn't always like match with what they seem to be feeling. So it's very, I mean, there's all these strange levels. So, I mean, to me, the fact that it's a kind of a critically loved film, I mean, I don't hold that against it.
No, I definitely love the inner monologue effect, because, I mean, it's a pattern, it's like a formal choice that goes through the whole film, because basically these characters don't express their feelings. They just like talk through inner monologues, and that's how you get to access to their interiority, but they never tell that to each other. So I found that choice to be very fascinating. It's more about how this change is lived by these characters. So it's more about affect than reason, logic. You know, it's also quite a transgressive thing to do. Maybe it doesn't look like that, but like Cüneyt, Kadir İnanır and Türkan Şoray, like these actors are so big in Turkey. Like these are the legends. So if you have like these two actors in the headline, you would want, like the audience would want them to end up together. Either that would like end up in a tragedy that one of them would die or something, which would like stop them to like be together, so you'd understand. But this is like a character is choosing his character over someone else over him. So it's like a very transgressive thing to do, actually, and they were quite worried whether this would work or not.
To go back to what you said at the start, I can totally see why, like if you wanted to get deeper into the Yılmazology, like why this would just be like a kind of a superficial pick. But I don't know, for me, I was completely taken by this film because it is also a Frankenstein. You know, it's not a fully assimilated film in the way that, for example, Belinda, which I could definitely appreciate and definitely loved watching. To me, that film is a little too, I don't want to say well made, but like well conceived is maybe the better idea, you know?
O vardı bir zamanlar. Onu sevmiştim. Sevgi o muydu? Sevgi neydi? Coşkun akan dere, sonbahar rüzgarıyla ürperen yapraklar, cama vurup dağılan yağmur damlaları. Bir yürek çarpıntı.
I was just wondering if we could give a shout out to The Wretched Ones. I mean, it's a film that basically, as I think you mentioned earlier, that is a film that he took over from Yılmaz Güney when Güney went to prison. And I mean, it's one of those films. I mean, these types of films are so fascinating to me when you will just have a very prominent film in a director's career that is another director's film in all the obvious characteristics, and yet you can never really take it away from this director that you're looking at, you know, in this case, because I can, easily see that this film is always considered a Güney film, and he's in it, he's on the poster, he's like, and it also, I mean, again, we've seen almost no Yılmaz films, but from what we've seen, there's nothing like this. And it's also very kind of arty and full of pathos and neurist, whatever. But I don't know, I'm always fascinated with these films, these films that are kind of collisions of sensibilities, and that like cinephile history is quick to dismiss the director who took over the job. It's to say like, oh, this is just a Yılmaz Güney film, not the Atıf Yılmaz film. But actually, I mean, to me, I'm not an expert, but there's a tension in this film that I find really fascinating.
While Chris was describing some of the things that happened with the guy with the red scarf in terms of like having this like facade of like what kind of like artsy film it is, but also having these like elements that would never be in that kind of film. I was thinking also along those lines with the Wretched Ones, the Poor, in the sense that again like has this kind of, if you look at the poster, if you look at the plot description, and even if you look at some other Güney films, like the only one I'm really familiar with is Elegy. Also, just the fact that when it goes to like the physical altercations, is perhaps like way more violent than I really expect a tasteful film to be. Which again, those kind of subversions, like it never is truly the kind of film that is supposed to be, in a sense. Since
in that time, Güney was also in period, Zeki Ökten took over the direction. Because it was so critically acclaimed, there's always like the discussion of whose film is this. But I think this one is more of Atıf Yılmaz than Yılmaz Güney, because it literally changed the script. Because the original version that Yılmaz Güney had in mind wouldn't be made without him, so he had to change the script to turn it into like the flashback element. Obviously, I came into the play because he wasn't there.
I mean, I don't know in what context this film would have shown, but I mean, it's very strong stuff. I mean, as Alonso said, I mean, you see a lot of kids getting beaten up in this film, and things like that, and it's very, very harsh, but then there's also I don't know, this is also kind of a bit of an outsider's thing, but just to me, just seeing the city and seeing these restaurants that they're eating in is like such a pleasure. I mean, like the kind of these bums hanging around the Hagia Sophia and smoking cigarettes, and I don't know, there's for all that film's harshness, there's also just kind of a pleasure of, your life sucks, you don't have any money, you're hungry, but you can sit around smoking cigarettes and talking shit about people.
I get a feeling that you've been a bit dismissive about the films after the 80s, because if we would ask like cinephiles, at least like a Turkish cinephiles or Turkish critics, I think they would want to talk more about the films that he made with Müjdar, for example, because like when you think about it, like the female sexuality was still a taboo at that time. So even after so many years, this idea of like sexualized figures stick with Müjdar, for example. So I think those films are quite bold in comparison with their time, like in depictions of of the sexuality.
Well, why didn't you guys like A Lonely Woman, which I didn't see? Because I know this is Alonso's first experience and was kind of this.
I didn't hate it. I see why it's important.
I didn't expect this film, like in this, I guess like now after seeing like the other 80s films, can understand why, of being very like tame and like I understand what Oiku was saying about like the importance perhaps contextually of this film, like addressing like female desire and sexuality in that sense, but I don't think it really translates to like what the film is going for, like cinematically. Like to me it's like very, and I guess we eventually might get into like the transition to the kind of like mise-en-scène he's doing in these films, which is sometimes very static and very prosaic, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But in this film, like I didn't even feel like the kind of like appeal I get from like when the melodramatic elements and like performances go to like the arch level, they kind of like elevate what's around him. In this case, it was like everything to me felt very contrived and perhaps like well thought out. I don't feel like it was like as confident conceptually with the other like quote unquote female films he did later on. Doesn't feel like as playful and as like high concept even.
I mean, it's a lonely woman. It's not the exact translation because it's like it's like actually a widow. So the woman is a widow. That's why she's lonely. Basically, she has a daughter, and the society kind of expects her to marry someone else, but she also lives or a part of this, let's say, artsy society. She has like a upper middle class. She belongs to like an upper middle class, and she has friends from this artsy circles. And she meets this photographer who's this, I don't know, like a fuckboy. I'm a bad guy. I'm a bad boy. I want like I only engage in situationships kind of guy comes into her life, and he pushes her into like this kind of transgressive like relationship that she ends up going outside the boundaries of sexuality that she set herself in for herself. And to parallel to that, she has a friend who pursues a man who's married, but she desperately wants to be with him. So she, no matter how he treats her, she just follows him. We have a scene, I don't know, Alonso, if you remember that scene where she runs naked to to embrace, to hug her friend. So there's also this kind of lesbian undertone, not necessarily overtly explored. At least that's how I interpret that part in the film. And it actually ends up like this utopian scenario where two friends just like happily hang out with one's daughter, also playing with them. So it's like low-key suggesting that like without men, these two women end up having this very happy and harmonious reality at the end. So maybe that's what appeals to the modern audiences in that film, this idea of potential female friendships. Because we know that Atıf Yılmaz explored queer sexuality, at least like hinted at queer sexuality in some of his other films, like Two Ships Side by Side from 1963 also has like a female, like two female characters kissing, or with Night Angel and Our Children, there's also a lot of different queer sexualities being explored. So why not? Maybe that's the appeal of this film, like unrealized potential about lesbian representation.
Thinking about that in the context of Arbelinda, which is not, I mean, you know, it is still pretty melodramatic, but it goes back to what I was saying before, that I feel like the film is like very, very well conceived, and I find that a bit of a burden on the film. You know, even though the actual experience of the film is very light, and I think this is kind of the film that I was referring to earlier when I said that, you know, just watching it is like very light and enjoyable to me because it's very clear and very watchable and so on. But, you know, I can see how in that film, I mean, which is kind of has this legendary premise, which is that this woman, actress, single, childless woman goes to shoot a shampoo commercial, and as she's like shampooing her hair, she opens her eyes and she realizes that she's in the world of the shampoo commercial. So she's married to the horrible man. She has the two little sprogs. She's in the shabby apartment. Those are the most interesting parts of the film to me, which is when you see her kind of playing again with her previous reality. So she goes to the theater and she starts to kind of perform again and wins over the same people with the same skills that she had before. Has this kind of like trashy neighbor friend, and when she brings that friend to the theater, you see these interesting moments where that friend feels judged by her old theater friends. So they have this more like kind of upper arty affect, and she's this kind of lowbrow working woman who never gets out, and when she tries to talk to them, they look down their nose at her. So there are these like kind of elements buried within the film like that, about class, about the fact that she's stuck with this horrible husband, the way he treats her, even though like he's trying to be compassionate, but he's basically always trying to fuck her. Almost I can see why people are so interested in this film, because the premise is so easy to grasp in a kind of feminist sense, you know.
I think there's also a tension between the social roles that are attributed to women and how if a woman is expected to like go out these roles, the society or her circle would punish her. Like this kind of, I don't want to say determinism, but there's definitely an exploration of or like a pushing the boundaries of like social determinism in his films. How can a woman, to what extent a woman can push these boundaries, go outside the roles that define her as such? And I think Ah Belinda does that. You haven't seen it, but how Asiye Nasıl Kurtulur, How to Save Asiye also does that. To some extent, The Woman Has No Name explores the several stages of woman in a woman's life and the roles like attributed to her: daughter, lover, writer, grown up, like those kind of things. I think is maybe, I don't know to what extent he consciously like makes this decision of exploring these themes, but I think it definitely is a recurrent theme.
To defend Belinda, if I might, I do think like again, I also kind of struggle with film being too clever, almost like on a screen like a script level. Of it's very clear, and I'll say even like heavy-handed what it's doing, like with the social context of the film. But I think like there's enough of the like farcical elements, particularly when like the fictional like TV like commercial world around here is kind of being like displayed. And also I think towards the climax, when it goes like beyond like the drama, there's like a lot of like comedy elements that perhaps in a more conventionally good film wouldn't necessarily be there, that are kind of like appealing to me, and shows that even in this more like revered work, there's still those populist impulses in there, which kind of like make it still be a film that I see like transcends just like that cinephile interest. Perhaps classicism of like the 60s films is like nowhere to be found here, but I kind of like think it kind of fits with what the film is going for, and perhaps that artless presentation of looking almost like televisual. I don't know, it was kind of like appealing to me in what I was kind of like foreshadowing at the beginning, like that just like purely telenovela kind of look and feel, which is somewhat jarring, like very like high contrast colors and saturation, and I love like very like static filmmaking, which again like I kind of like have a soft spot for in this period in particular, I think.
Sağlıklı, ışıl ışıl, taptaze Belinda, doğanın fısıltısı.
Evet, çok güzel.
Bir mutluluk pırıltısı.
Ailenizin büyülü şampuanı.
Belinda. Tamam efendim. Şimdi oldu.
Tutkunun asıl adı.
Bir mutluluk pırıltısı. Belinda.
It's just kind of occurred to me that we've been speaking for quite a while about Yılmaz, and we've never really spoken about a style about these films. Probably just because there's just so many to grapple with, but I think also, you know, even in his best films, like in the saga of even in, I mean that film has like definitely these sort of like high style flourishes, but he always seems to me to be a film kind of like a craftsman filmmaker. You know, there aren't a lot of sort of ostentatious stylistic
because of
elements.
the scarcity of film stock. Actually, he would always like compose his shots before how he wants to shoot, so that he knows what he was doing. Like he would like paint and like draw the camera movements, the mise en scène, and the perspectives. So it's not very, let's say, spontaneous decisions. He would know what he wants to shoot when he was shooting.
It definitely has that. I mean, and I really don't want to say it in a derogatory way, but it definitely has that uber competent craftsman vibe, you know, where just like everything's flowing. There's not a lot of sort of odd bits and pieces. Like the things are flowing. It's easy to watch. It's not stupid. It's not just super conventional, but there's a kind of just natural flow to the images. And I think that's something that basically unites all of them. You know, there's not a lot of sort of high art in terms of like a scene unfolding in an entire shot, or a sort of languorous pan in this direction or whatever. It's like very sort of to the point.
His films, because he often makes adaptations, kind of resist the auteurist reading of his own films.
Yeah, it's also interesting that we sitting here are imposing all these readings on the films and all these interpretations which are completely off, which is enjoyable too. I guess it was only you, Oiku, who saw The Night Angel and Our Children.
I mean, I think it's a fascinating historical document to like witness this period, like totally bygone period, and nightlife of Istanbul. To me, it was so shocking, and then also felt bad about like not knowing about this film more, that this film existed. Like, because you always think that, oh, I mean, yeah, it was basically this period and these identities, these sexualities weren't represented. I would have assumed this, and that's why I feel bad about not knowing about this film. Basically, the story, the life of three women converge, paths cross, and there's also this older sex worker who's obsessed with this man called Osman, who's just released from the jail, and she wants desperately to find her and be with him, but he categorically rejects her because she literally stabbed him. So this really tragic paths of Atıf Yılmaz basically puts us in this web of relationships, this unrealized love stories and tragic paths. And it's more of a, I think, choral story, or like a portrait of a period then, unique and coherent storyline. So I think narrative-wise, it's not that convincing, but you find yourself more interested in the depiction of the 90s, the nightlife, the actual scenes, the trans people walking down the street, their interactions, the language they use. I think these elements become more interesting than the storyline itself.
Strikes me as kind of incredible that this film exists. And then also the fact that it's basically his last major film. You have these incredibly prolific filmmakers, and at some point, whether it's health, personal life, family, whatever, just drops off. And I think Yilmaz is like that, until, what is it, like 1988, he's still making, 2 films a year, 1 film a year at least. And then suddenly, around... this is basically like the sort of last major film, and then he just makes a couple of things after that, and then he dies in 2006.
But that's also because of the industry. Like you no one was making that many films per year. So it's not just about him, but also I think the reality of the film industry of that time. Because you had the means of making films before, and now you just like can't afford making it.
Doing a little project like this in 2 weeks is completely absurd, of course. But it's very interesting to me because I think this is probably of the subjects that we've done the one that I was kind of least familiar with. Not just him, but also like the kind of context that these films were made in. So I was kind of, experiencing it on 2 levels. I was experiencing it as a kind of Atıf Yılmaz deep dive, but also as this sort of exposure to a certain way of making films over a few periods. So, I feel like I use this when we sum up every episode, but it feels like, we just scratched the surface and we need to just keep digging and digging and digging.
There are some, I think, interest for historical adventure flicks in Turkish cinema, but I also don't like that these films are only framed as, terrible, bad, rip-offs of... that people approach these as bad taste films. We also joke about it, but to a certain degree, it becomes, I think, Cüneyt Arkın, so bad, it's so funny.
Perhaps that's going back to the Latin American reference, a little bit like what for a long time we were speaking in the Santo episode of how local audiences were taught these films are bad and you shouldn't take them seriously, and at the same time they kind of transcend these discussions just by being there all the time. In this context, being shown in TV and being shown in these less prestigious spaces. So to me, that's also was interesting of doing this very exploratory and very initial dive into Yilmaz's career, just seeing different avenues and possibilities of what his work could entail, and also having that taste, particularly of the 60s, so area that we'll definitely be going back to.
So that was the surface of Atıf Yılmaz filmography. What else have you guys been watching this week?
I was in Brussels last weekend and the Brussels Cinematheque is amazing. So I just went to see basically whatever they were showing over a few days. And I saw The Terminator, I saw Night of the Hunter, Buster Keaton's Three Ages, and Yojimbo by Kurosawa, which I'd never seen. All of them on 35 on various levels of good prints. So I don't know, like for me, sometimes it's also just really necessary to do that, just to spend some time with the classics. I've seen almost all of those films except Yojimbo, so it's also just a process of rediscovery and just sort of basking in these beautiful prints. It's like such a luxurious place that just has 3 screenings a day, very cheap tickets, and you just go, and I don't know. Of course I love watching the Atıf Yılmaz films, the homework for this podcast, but then also, it's nice to see Night of the Hunter after 15 years. I don't know. I feel like I would lose my reputation on this podcast if I described that as a palate cleanser, but but I mean, Night of the Hunter, I haven't seen Night of the Hunter since I was 16. And it's such an amazing film, such a singular film in every way. And also seeing films from that time, especially these films that are kind of canonized, and now if you want to see Night of the Hunter, you have to see it Blu-ray, I guess. Seeing it on a print and seeing that kind of like vibrating quality of the images in 35mm was really, really special. What about you guys? What have you been watching?
I went to a couple of screenings of Queer East, which is kind of like a queer East Asian film festival that's in London. There's 2 discoveries I think I had were very different in register. One is the Yu Ping film called The Outsiders, which is kind of like in contrast to like the tasteful Edward Yang new wave of Taiwanese cinema style. This kind of like more like a popular film. It was done like in the mid 80s. He was apparently, from what I could catch in his career, kind of like gone by hire filmmaker. He has kind of like an early like horror wuxia films, some like samurai films, some like broad comedies. But this film was based in Crystal Boy, which is apparently a very important like queer like novel that was written in the 80s in Taiwan. And the film was heavily censored originally, so actually it's only starting to do the rounds in recent years because it's like a new restoration that was showing. And the film is kind of like this, it has some melodramatic elements, but it plays most of the time as like this like broad comedy, because one of the actors and perhaps like the star vehicle is Sun Jue, which was a very famous and popular like a Taiwanese comedic actor in the 1970s and 80s. So here he plays some sort of like very flamboyant and colorful, kind of like even perhaps problematic in retrospect, kind of depiction of like a homosexual character. And he kind of like becomes this motherly figure to this group of like outcast of like teenagers and like of like young like gay men who are doing like cruising and selling like and doing prostitution like in the park. They kind of like create this like dysfunctional family dynamic. So it plays a lot of like humor around the fact of like society's reaction to like just people being like openly gay, but also it has like some very weird like mannerisms. So like dream sequences that look straight out like 80s action, 80s Hong Kong action films, which again like he did some of those films that like it's inspired by those and like the Taiwanese variant of co-production of those films, and also like a lot of like this kind of like 80s youthful exploitation kind of film style of like a lot of like leather jackets and like synth soundtrack, like gay bar dance sequences. So it's like I kind of like looks to be I can see why this film will perhaps eventually become more of like a cult classic, despite not having a lot of like cinephile like hardcore tourist interest. Just like as a pop film, I think it's like very very valuable for what it's going for, and just like the like crass value of its humor and the things it goes for. And on the other side of the spectrum, totally other side of the spectrum, perhaps even like a similarly well-known filmmaker in some like experimental circles, Hiroyuki Oki, which is kind of like also like a queer filmmaker from Japan, mostly doing like diaristic and like essayistic films around framing like his like partner's bodies in different like ambiances and like playing a lot with like a male desire. And the film I just want to mention is like a melody for Buddy Matsume, which basically it's like 50 minutes and like chronicles 10 days. Each sequence is essentially like 5 minutes, just like seeing like minutia and like going around town and like looking at like his partner, and like then again the second half of the film, it just like very like intimate, like 8mm textures of like the absence of the figure we saw during the first part of the film. So there's like almost like an structuralist element, but also always framed within this a very like tender and affectionate and intimate look into again like almost kind of like a love letter to the figure of Buddy. What about you, Oiku?
Maybe our listeners would remember that we talked about Edward Yang in the previous episode, and I went to Taipei, and I actually like had an experience of like worthy of film itself, but that's another topic of discussion. But I was invited to cover the Taiwan International Documentary Film Festival, and one of the side sections of this festival was called Taiwan Spectrum, and they featured like films from a war period and archival documentaries, and one of the most interesting, the most fascinating ones was called Archive/Li Guanghui. Sorry for the terrible pronunciation, but it's actually an archival compilation film about indigenous Taiwanese who become a soldier in Japanese army, and who disappeared for almost 30 years after the World War II, and lived in Indonesia and came back, presumed death, and then found and came back to Taiwan after 30 years. So it's basically his return to his homeland, and it's basically a newsreel, but the way he's welcomed, the way his identity is totally shattered, is so vivid in this film that you just like watch it with like blown away, because his family welcome him, this man who was completely away, presumed death, like this, a man who doesn't exist basically, and he's not the same man. The image of the family or the whole community reflects on him is totally different from his own being after so many years. And there's obviously a voiceover comment that explains what is going on in the footage, but in a very comprehensive way, because it's also supposed to be listened. So you get all these like descriptions of details, what he's wearing, what the cigarette, the brand of cigarette that they offer to him to his smoke. Like they describe everything that's going on in the frame, and he's welcomed with so much enthusiasm and vivid emotions that you feel his overwhelmed reaction, but also dissociation, like who am I, who is this person they're cheering for? And there's this one particular scene that he's like welcomed by the kids of the village or his family, the kids that he doesn't know, like who he doesn't know who these kids are, and he has to like hug them, like show love and affection to them, and the camera zooms to his hands, the children's faces, and it's so disorienting and disturbing to watch these moments. And from the Q&A, I couldn't understand what they were saying, but from the Q&A I learned that his wife, thinking that he died, married someone else, and then upon his return he got so angry that he didn't want to meet her first, and they convinced him to meet her. And also they asked the new husband to like go away because he returned. I'm sorry, it's so incredible, this story. And like a couple of years later, like barely a couple of years later, only 4 I think, he passes away from lung cancer, and the new husband comes back, continuing to live with the wife. Such a crazy story. basically, this was one of the highlights of the whole festival.
So that was it for this very introductory approximation to the work of Atıf Yılmaz. Next week, we'll be touching upon the work of Jocelyn Saab. If you have any comments, complaints, or any form of like dialogue you want to establish with us, you can reach out at outskirtsfilmmagazine@gmail.com. And be sure to follow the podcast every 2 weeks on your favorite streaming platform.